Rochelle Avery spent every Saturday cleaning luxury homes in a faded housekeeping uniform, while her husband Ethan laughed that she would never amount to anything more than the maid. One afternoon he mocked her one time too many and stormed into an estate to prove she was embarrassing him. But the moment the front doors opened, the staff stood at attention. The butler greeted Rochelle with, "Welcome home, Miss Avery." Ethan froze. Then he noticed every framed property deed displayed in the office carried one identical name, and that name belonged to his wife. In the quiet hours before sunrise, long before the city of Charlotte stirred awake, Rochelle Avery was already dressed and moving through the small house she shared with her husband. She was 39 years old, calm in a way that unsettled people who mistook stillness for weakness, and she moved through her mornings with the same quiet discipline she brought to everything else in her life. Her uniform hung on the back of the closet door where it always hung, plain and gray, the fabric softened by years of washing. She pulled it on without complaint, tied her hair back, and packed a small bag with cleaning supplies she never truly needed but carried anyway, because habits built over years do not disappear, simply because circumstances have changed. Down the hallway, she could already hear Ethan stirring, and she braced herself the way a person braces for weather they know is coming. Ethan Mercer was 41, a sales manager who measured his own worth by the opinions of men he considered more successful than himself, and he measured his wife's worth the same way. He appeared in the kitchen doorway that morning in a pressed shirt, coffee already in hand, and looked at Rochelle the way he looked at her most mornings, with a mixture of irritation and something close to embarrassment. "You're almost 40, he said, not for the first time, watching her check the contents of her bag. Still scrubbing toilets at your age." Rochelle did not look up. She had learned over the years that silence often carried more dignity than any answer she could offer, and she zipped her bag closed with the same steady hands she used for everything. "You embarrass me," Ethan added, setting his mug down harder than necessary, the sound sharp against the granite counter. "Do you know what my coworkers would say if they knew my wife cleaned houses for a living? I tell people you do administrative work. I have to, Rochelle, because the truth is humiliating." He said this as though it were a kindness he extended to her, a favor paid for with his own discomfort. And Rochelle finally looked at him with an expression that gave nothing away. She thought, as she often did, that a man who needed his wife's job title to feel respected among his friends had already told her everything she needed to know about the shape of his character. She said nothing of this out loud. She simply gathered her bag, kissed him on the cheek out of habit rather than affection, and walked toward the front door without raising her voice. Ethan called after her, his tone somewhere between smug and wounded, the tone of a man who believed he was the one being wronged. "I mean it," he said. "Don't expect me to ever introduce you as a housekeeper to anyone who matters. Not to my boss, not to my friends, not to anyone." The door closed behind her before he finished the sentence, though the words followed her down the driveway and into her car, settling somewhere in her chest where old wounds tend to gather without ever fully healing. Anyone watching Rochelle drive away that morning would have assumed she was simply another woman heading into another long day of labor she could not escape, her hands rough, her patience worn thin by a husband who saw her as beneath him. They would have been wrong about almost everything except the part about her hands, which were indeed rough from years of work, though not the kind of work Ethan imagined. As she pulled out of the neighborhood and onto the wider roads leading toward the city's most exclusive district, her expression softened into something closer to peace than sorrow, because whatever waited for her at the end of that drive was not humiliation. It was, in ways her husband could not begin to understand, home, she thought, as the radio played quietly and the neighborhoods around her grew wider and greener, about the many mornings just like this one, mornings that began with insults and ended with something closer to purpose. She had married Ethan 9 years earlier, back when his ambition had looked to her like determination rather than insecurity, back when she had still believed that love given honestly would eventually be returned in kind. She had never hidden anything from him outright, never constructed an elaborate deception designed to trap him in ignorance. But she had also never corrected the story he built for himself, the story where she was simply a woman with modest means and modest dreams. Some part of her, she admitted quietly to herself during these long drives, had wanted to see how long it would take him to ask a real question, to wonder aloud what filled her days beyond the uniform he found so distasteful. 9 years was a long time to wait for a question that never came. The estate Rochelle pulled into that morning sat behind a long stretch of manicured hedges, its stone facade catching the early light in a way that made the whole property look as though it belonged in a different century. She parked in the same spot she always parked, near the side entrance rather than the front, out of habit more than necessity. A groundskeeper named Frank Dillard waved to her as she stepped out, calling her by name with the easy familiarity of someone who had known her for years, and she waved back with the same warmth. Inside, the staff moved through their morning routines, the way staff moved in houses with real structure and real leadership, quietly, efficiently, and with a kind of respect that had nothing to do with fear. A woman named Diane Whitfield, who managed the household staff at this particular property, greeted Rochelle at the door with a smile that suggested this was not merely a professional relationship, but something closer to genuine regard. "We've got the West Wing ready for your walkthrough," Diane said, holding the door open. "The new drapery arrived yesterday, exactly the fabric you approved." Rochelle nodded, already scanning the entryway with the practiced eye of someone who noticed details other people missed. The slight unevenness in a rug's placement, a smudge on a banister that housekeeping had overlooked. She made small notes in a leather notebook she carried everywhere, not because anyone required it of her, but because she believed quality was built one small correction at a time. She moved from room to room that morning with quiet authority, though nothing in her manner suggested authority in the way most people expected it to look. She spoke to the staff, not as subordinates, but as colleagues, asking about their families, remembering the names of their children, thanking them for work well done before she ever mentioned anything that needed improvement. A young housekeeper, named Tasha Coleman, new to the estate, watched Rochelle with visible confusion, unsure whether the woman moving so purposefully through the halls was a fellow employee or something else entirely. Rochelle caught the look and simply smiled, offering no explanation, because explanations were not something she offered easily to anyone, least of all to people she had only just met. By mid-morning, her phone buzzed with a call she had been expecting, and she stepped into a quiet hallway to answer it. On the other end was Vivian Sloan, the attorney who had managed the entirety of Rochelle's affairs for close to a decade, her voice brisk and businesslike as always. "We need your approval before Monday," Vivian said, without preamble, the way she always spoke when time mattered more than pleasantries. "The Ashford property closing depends on it, and there are 3 other matters sitting on my desk that cannot wait much longer." Rochelle promised she would review the documents that evening, her tone calm despite the weight of what was being discussed, and ended the call with the same composure she carried into every conversation. Nothing about her posture, her expression, or her voice hinted at the scale of what Vivian's words actually meant, and that, more than anything, was exactly how Rochelle preferred it. That same week, Ethan attended a gathering hosted by his closest colleagues, the kind of evening built around expensive wine and careful posturing, where every conversation doubled as a quiet competition for status. Rochelle came along because he asked her to, dressed simply, standing slightly apart from the cluster of men discussing their careers, as though careers were the only currency worth discussing. A woman named Karen Whitlock, married to one of Ethan's co-workers, turned to Rochelle with the kind of polite curiosity people extend to strangers at parties. "So, what is it you do?" Karen asked, swirling her glass, her tone light but her eyes sharp with the particular interest people reserve for sizing others up. Before Rochelle could answer, Ethan laughed, the sound carrying across the small circle of guests gathered near the bar. "She cleans rich people's houses," he said, delivering the line the way a man delivers a joke he has told many times before, confident it would land the way it always landed. Several people laughed along with him, not unkindly exactly, but with the easy cruelty of people who assumed the target of their laughter would simply absorb it and move on. Rochelle did exactly that, at least outwardly, offering a small, unreadable smile that gave the room nothing to work with. She had grown skilled, over the years, at letting laughter pass through her without leaving a mark, though the skill had cost her something each time she used it. "Why don't you quit?" someone else asked. A man named Brian Castellano, who worked alongside Ethan, His question posed with the kind of condescension people mistake for genuine concern. Surely there's something better out there for someone your age. Rochelle met his eyes directly, her voice steady when she finally spoke. Because I love my work, she said simply, offering nothing further. No justification, no elaboration, because the truth did not require an audience's approval to remain true. The silence that followed was brief, but noticeable. The kind of pause that occurs when an answer arrives with more confidence than the question anticipated. Ethan filled the gap quickly, eager to steer the conversation elsewhere, uncomfortable with anything that made him look less in control of the narrative surrounding his own marriage. Later that night, in the car on the way home, Ethan spoke without looking at her, his hands tight on the wheel. "You'll never belong in those houses you clean," he said, the words landing with a casual cruelty that suggested he believed them completely. "People like us don't get invited into that kind of world, Rochelle. We just clean up after the people who do." Rochelle turned to look out the window, watching the city lights blur past, and said nothing at all. She thought, not for the first time, that her husband's greatest limitation was not his ambition, but his imagination, his complete inability to conceive of a world larger than the one his insecurities had built around him. Later that same week, at another gathering, hosted by a different circle of Ethan's colleagues, the conversation drifted once more toward careers and titles, the currency by which this particular crowd measured every relationship in the room. A man named Gregory Fenn, recently promoted at the firm where Ethan worked, spoke at length about his upcoming vacation to somewhere expensive, pausing occasionally to ask others about their own plans for the coming summer. When the question reached Rochelle, Ethan answered for her before she could open her mouth, explaining with a practiced laugh that her only summer plans involved someone else's swimming pool and someone else's garden hedges. The room laughed again, the same easy laughter that cost Ethan nothing and cost Rochelle a little more each time she absorbed it without complaint, though nobody in that room, including her husband, understood the true cost of what they found so amusing. In the weeks that followed, small details began accumulating in ways that would have caught the attention of anyone paying close attention, though Ethan remained too preoccupied with his own frustrations to notice much of anything. Rochelle signed documents in the evenings at the kitchen table, her handwriting neat and practiced, while Ethan watched television in the next room without ever asking what the papers contained. A courier arrived one afternoon with an envelope marked confidential, and when Ethan asked about it, Rochelle simply said it was paperwork related to one of the properties where she worked, an answer technically true and deliberately incomplete. Staff members at the estates began greeting her differently, too, in ways that would have seemed strange to anyone watching closely. A housekeeper at one property called her ma'am, with a formality that seemed excessive for a fellow employee, and a groundskeeper at another tipped his hat the way people tip their hats to someone whose approval matters to their livelihood. Rochelle never corrected these small gestures of deference, never explained them away, simply accepted them with the same quiet grace she extended to everything else in her life. It was as though she existed in two entirely separate worlds, one where she was dismissed and diminished, and another where she was treated with a respect that bordered on reverence, and she moved between them without ever revealing the seams. A bank representative called one evening while Ethan was in the room, and Rochelle stepped outside to take the call, her voice too low for him to make out the details. A construction company called another day, asking about the timeline for renovations on a property Ethan had never heard mentioned before. An architect left a voicemail referencing blueprints and permits, a message Rochelle deleted before Ethan ever noticed the notification. She declined meeting after meeting that month, always finding reasons to delay, always returning instead to the same routine of driving to estates in her worn uniform, and spending her days scrubbing counters and inspecting linens as though nothing unusual were happening in her life at all. During those same weeks, Rochelle found herself thinking often about her grandmother, a woman named Ida May Avery, who had purchased her very first property with money saved from decades of domestic work, not unlike the work Rochelle still performed each Saturday. Ida May had never lived to see the empire her small investments eventually became, passing away when Rochelle was still in her 20s. but she had left behind a single piece of advice that Rochelle carried with her into every property she inspected. Money, her grandmother used to say, only reveals the truth of a person's character. It never creates that character to begin with. And a person who becomes cruel or arrogant with wealth was likely cruel or arrogant long before the wealth arrived to prove it. Rochelle thought of those words often when Ethan mocked her uniform, understanding that his contempt had nothing to do with mops and buckets and everything to do with a hierarchy he had built inside his own mind long before he ever met her. Vivian called again near the end of the month, her tone carrying the particular urgency of someone whose patience, while professional, was not infinite. "All the paperwork is sitting here waiting for your signature," she reminded Rochelle, during a brief call taken in the privacy of a hallway. "The board wants this finalized before the quarter closes, and I cannot hold them off much longer." Rochelle promised, as she always promised, that she would handle it soon. And true to her word, she did handle it. Quietly, efficiently, without a single person, outside a small circle of trusted advisors, ever knowing the scale of what she managed. She simply preferred it that way, believing that a life built loudly around wealth was rarely a life built well. It was Ethan's own suspicion, ironically, that finally cracked open the careful separation Rochelle had maintained for so long. He had noticed her secrecy, the phone calls taken in other rooms, the documents signed and tucked away before he could glance at them, and his mind, already primed by his own insecurities, leapt toward the explanation that felt most familiar to him. He began to wonder if his wife was having an affair, if the long hours she spent away from home involved something other than the mops and buckets she claimed defined her days, and the thought festered in him with the particular intensity of a man unwilling to consider that the truth might be something he had simply never bothered to ask about. One Saturday morning, instead of going to work himself, Ethan followed her car at a careful distance, his jaw tight with a mixture of anger and wounded pride. He watched her turn onto roads that grew progressively wider and more manicured, past hedges trimmed with surgical precision, and gates that required codes rather than simple locks, and his suspicion only deepened with every mile. When she finally pulled through an iron gate that swung open automatically at her approach, Ethan parked a short distance away and sat behind the wheel, staring at the estate before him with a growing sense that something about this entire situation did not add up the way he had assumed. He watched as a man in a tailored uniform, older, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in careful service, opened the front door for Rochelle before she had even reached the steps. The man greeted her with visible warmth, and though Ethan could not hear the words exchanged, the body language told him enough to feel a strange discomfort settling into his chest, something between confusion and a fear he could not yet name. He told himself, gripping the steering wheel, that his wife was simply well liked among the staff of a house she cleaned, that there was nothing more to this than a housekeeper, being treated kindly by people who valued reliable help. But something in the scene refused to sit easily with that explanation, and after several minutes of internal argument, Ethan stepped out of his car and walked toward the gate. The staff member who greeted Ethan at the entrance was Malcolm Hayes, 62 years old, a man who had served as head of household for this particular estate for over 2 decades, and who carried himself with a quiet dignity earned through years of discretion and loyalty. Malcolm studied Ethan for a moment before speaking, his expression polite but unreadable, the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned to reveal nothing until he understood exactly what a situation required of him. "Can I help you, sir?" Malcolm asked, his tone courteous but firm, the tone of someone accustomed to managing unexpected visitors without ever losing his composure. Ethan stammered out an explanation, something about being Rochelle's husband, something about wanting to see what kind of house his wife spent her Saturdays cleaning, and Malcolm's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, though he said nothing to correct whatever assumptions Ethan was carrying. "Right this way," Malcolm said instead, stepping aside to allow Ethan through the door, and something about the ease of that invitation, the complete absence of hesitation one might expect before letting a stranger into a house of this scale, should have told Ethan more than it did. He walked through the entrance with the swagger of a man expecting to finally catch his wife in some kind of deception, his mind already rehearsing the confrontation he intended to have with her the moment he found her. What Ethan found instead, the moment he stepped fully into the grand foyer, was a scene that stopped him completely in his tracks. The entire household staff, perhaps a dozen people in total, stood arranged in two neat rows along either side of the entrance hall, their posture straight, their expressions attentive, the unmistakable formation of people prepared to welcome someone of considerable importance. Rochelle stood at the center of the hall, having just removed her jacket, and as she turned toward the group, every member of the staff spoke in near unison, their voices carrying a warmth that left no room for doubt about the sincerity behind the words. "Welcome home, Miss Avery," they said, and the phrase landed in the room like something solid, something that could not be misheard or misunderstood, no matter how badly Ethan wanted it to mean something other than what it clearly meant. Ethan stood frozen near the doorway, his mouth slightly open, his mind scrambling to construct an explanation that would allow the world to keep making the kind of sense he had always assumed it made. He told himself there had been some mistake, that perhaps the staff had confused his wife with someone else, that surely a housekeeper did not receive greetings reserved for the lady of the house. But then Malcolm stepped forward, addressing Rochelle with the same easy familiarity he might use with any employer he had served faithfully for years, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "Everything is ready for your inspection, Miss Avery," Malcolm said, gesturing toward the hallway beyond. "The West Wing renovation is complete, and the new staff orientation begins Monday, pending your final approval." The words hit Ethan like a slow accumulation of small shocks, each one compounding the last, until the entire foundation of what he believed about his marriage began to visibly crack apart in front of him. He looked at Rochelle, searching her face for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, some explanation that would restore the world to the shape he had always known it to have. But her expression carried only the same calm composure she wore through every difficulty life presented her. She did not look surprised. She did not look caught. She looked, if anything, like a woman finally standing in a place where she did not need to shrink herself to fit someone else's expectations. "Rochelle," Ethan finally managed, his voice unsteady in a way it had never been unsteady in their entire marriage. "What is going on here? Why is everyone calling you that? Why are they treating you like you own this place?" His questions tumbled out faster than he could organize them, and for the first time in years, Rochelle watched her husband experience the particular vertigo of a man discovering that the story he had told himself about his own life was built on assumptions he had never bothered to verify. She said nothing immediately, choosing instead to lead him further into the house, past the grand staircase and down a hallway lined with framed photographs and certificates, toward a room she rarely brought anyone into at all. The office Rochelle led him into was quiet, lined with dark wood shelving and windows that overlooked a garden maintained with the same meticulous care as everything else on the property. Ethan's eyes moved across the walls, almost involuntarily, drawn to the framed documents arranged in careful rows, dozens of them, each bearing official seals and formal language that made clear exactly what they represented: property deeds, ownership certificates, legal documents establishing title to land and buildings across the region, each one different in its specifics, but identical in the single detail that mattered most in that moment. Every single document bore the same name, printed in clear, formal lettering that left absolutely no room for doubt or reinterpretation: Rochelle Avery. Ethan moved closer to the wall, his hands trembling slightly, as he reached out to touch the frame of one document, as though physical contact might somehow reveal it to be a fabrication, a joke constructed for reasons he could not begin to understand. He read the address on one deed, then another, recognizing the second as belonging to a property he had once admired from the street during a drive through the city's most exclusive neighborhood. A house he had once remarked to a friend must belong to someone extraordinarily wealthy. He had never imagined, in all his years of dismissing his wife's daily labor, that the answer to that idle comment had been standing beside him in the passenger seat of his own car. Vivian Sloane entered the office a few moments later, having been summoned by Malcolm the moment Ethan arrived, her expression composed but carrying an edge of something close to satisfaction. the quiet vindication of a woman who had watched this exact moment approach for years without ever being permitted to hasten it. "Mr. Mercer," she said, extending a hand he did not immediately think to shake. "I'm Vivian Sloane. I manage your wife's estate, and I have for the better part of 10 years. She let the words settle before continuing, her tone measured and precise. The tone of a woman accustomed to explaining complicated realities to people who had never bothered to ask the right questions. "Your wife owns more than 30 properties across this state," Vivian continued, gesturing toward the walls surrounding them. "Residential estates, several commercial buildings downtown, and a property management company that oversees all of it, employing close to 200 people between the various sites." She paused, watching Ethan's face carefully as the numbers settled over him like a weight he had no framework for carrying. "She built this, or rather, she inherited the foundation of it and built the rest herself, quietly, over many years, without needing anyone's permission or approval to do so." Ethan looked from Vivian to Rochelle, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something that resembled the beginning of shame, though he was not yet fully prepared to feel it in its entirety. "How is this possible?" he finally asked, his voice smaller than Rochelle had heard it in years, stripped of the confidence and condescension that usually colored his speech. "You clean houses, Rochelle. You wake up at 5 in the morning and put on that uniform and scrub floors. How does someone who does that own 30 properties?" Rochelle studied him for a long moment before answering, weighing how much of the truth he had earned in that moment, how much explanation his years of dismissiveness actually deserved. Eventually, she decided the truth mattered more than any punishment withholding it might deliver, and she began to speak, her voice steady, carrying the particular calm of someone finally allowed to stop hiding. Her family, she explained, had invested in real estate decades earlier, long before the neighborhoods they purchased into became the desirable districts they were today, back when property in those areas was affordable to families willing to take a long view on value that would not materialize for years. Her grandmother had started with a single duplex, purchased with savings scraped together over a lifetime of careful work, and had taught her mother, who taught Rochelle in turn, that real wealth was built patiently and protected quietly, never flaunted, never announced. When her parents passed, years before she and Ethan had ever met, Rochelle inherited not just properties but a philosophy, one that valued substance over appearance and quiet competence over public display. She had never lied to Ethan about who she was, she reminded him gently, though she acknowledged she had also never corrected the assumptions he formed, and never questioned. When they met, she had been working alongside her own household staff, learning every role from the ground up, because she believed a person could not properly manage what they did not understand firsthand. Ethan had assumed, based on her uniform and her modest car and her unwillingness to discuss money, that she was simply a working woman with limited means, and she had allowed that assumption to stand because it had never once occurred to her that a husband's respect for his wife should depend on the size of her bank account rather than the substance of her character. "You never asked," Rochelle said quietly. "In 9 years of marriage, you never once asked me what I actually wanted from my life. You only told me what you assumed it was." She continued cleaning houses, she explained, not out of necessity, but out of principle, because she believed a person who managed properties without ever doing the physical labor themselves eventually lost the ability to recognize good work when they saw it. She wanted to understand what her employees experienced each day, the ache in their backs by evening, the particular exhaustion of scrubbing floors that would be dirty again within a week, so that she could lead a company that respected labor rather than merely extracting it. Every Saturday she spent cleaning was, in her mind, an act of humility rather than deprivation, a discipline that kept her connected to the values her grandmother had instilled in her, long before wealth had ever entered the picture. Ethan had mistaken her humility for poverty, and in doing so, had revealed far more about his own values than he had ever revealed about hers. She told him, too, about the early years of managing the properties on her own, back when she was still in her late 20s, learning contract law late at night after long days spent supervising renovations she barely understood at the time. She had made mistakes during those years, some agreements she later rewound, young, trusted contractors who took advantage of her inexperience. And she had rebuilt her approach piece by piece, until the company Vivian now helped her run functioned with the precision of a much larger operation. None of that struggle had ever been visible to Ethan, because she had built it during the years before they met and continued building it quietly during the years after, never once presenting it to him as an achievement that required his approval or his attention. She had simply lived her life the way she believed a person should live it, with integrity intact, whether or not anyone else was watching. The silence that followed stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable, and Ethan finally sat down heavily in one of the office chairs, his hands covering his face as the full weight of years of casual cruelty settled over him at once. He thought of every dismissive comment he had made at dinner parties, every joke delivered at her expense to earn a laugh from colleagues who mattered less to him than he had ever admitted. Every morning he had criticized her uniform without once asking why she chose to wear it. He thought of the party where he had laughed about her cleaning rich people's houses, never imagining that the punchline of his own joke was that his wife likely owned half the houses in the room where he told it. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, in a way Rochelle had rarely seen in their entire marriage. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, the words coming out rough and unpracticed, as though apology were a muscle he had simply never bothered to exercise. "I don't even know where to start apologizing from. I called you embarrassing. I told people you did nothing important. I made you feel small for years, and the entire time you were building something I couldn't have built if I'd had 10 lifetimes to do it." He shook his head, staring at the floor rather than at her, unable to hold her gaze through the shame now visibly working through him. "I think I loved the idea of being better than someone more than I ever actually loved you for who you are. I'm ashamed of that. I don't know how to fix it, but I'm ashamed of it." Rochelle listened to his apology without interrupting, allowing him the full weight of his own words, because she believed a person needed to sit inside their regret rather than have it rushed past for the comfort of everyone else in the room. When he finished, she remained quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer honestly rather than simply offering the forgiveness he seemed to be waiting for. "The saddest part wasn't that you mocked my work," she finally said, her voice steady despite the years of hurt threaded through it. She paused, letting the silence stretch before continuing, choosing her next words with the deliberate care she brought to everything in her life. "It was that you never respected the woman doing it," Rochelle continued. "You didn't just fail to see 30 properties and a management company, Ethan. You failed to see me. You built an entire understanding of your wife around a job title, and the moment you thought that title was beneath you, you decided I was beneath you too. That's not about money. That would have been true even if none of this existed, even if I really was only a housekeeper with nothing else to my name." She gestured toward the walls of framed documents surrounding them, then let her hand fall back to her side. "None of this changes who I've always been. It only changes what you're finally being forced to see." Ethan absorbed her words in silence, and Rochelle watched something shift behind his eyes. The slow, dawning recognition of a man realizing that wealth had not been the missing piece explaining his failures as a husband, but merely the evidence exposing failures that had existed all along. He reached for her hand, tentative in a way he had rarely been throughout their marriage, and she allowed the contact without offering the reassurance he seemed to be hoping for. Some wounds, she had learned, did not heal simply because the person who caused them finally understood the damage. Understanding was a beginning, not a resolution, and Rochelle was not yet certain what resolution, if any, she wanted from a marriage built on 9 years of quiet condescension she had only recently allowed herself to fully acknowledge. In the weeks that followed, Rochelle made a decision that surprised everyone who expected her to seek some form of retribution against a husband who had spent years diminishing her in front of others. She did not humiliate him publicly the way he had humiliated her, did not correct the record among his friends, or reveal the truth to the colleagues who had laughed along with his cruel jokes at that party months earlier. Instead, she suggested a separation, calm and measured, explaining to Ethan that she needed space to determine whether the marriage they had built could ever become something honest, or whether it had been broken by assumptions long before either of them was willing to admit it. Ethan, to his credit, did not argue. accepting her decision with a humility that had been entirely absent from him before. That Saturday afternoon changed everything he believed about his own life. Rochelle continued exactly as she had before, waking early each morning, pulling on the same faded uniform she had worn for years, driving to whichever estate needed her attention that day. She still inspected every room personally, still made notes in her leather notebook about details other people missed, still asked her staff about their families, and remembered the names of their children without fail. Nothing about her daily rhythm changed, because the wealth had never been the point of her life in the first place. Only the quiet byproduct of values she had carried since childhood, values that had nothing to do with houses or deeds or the opinions of anyone who judged her worth by the uniform she chose to wear. Ethan, meanwhile, spent those same months in a small apartment across town, working through the discomfort of a solitude he had never before experienced, forced for the first time to examine his own reflection without the comfort of someone else to diminish for contrast. He called Rochelle occasionally, always respectful of the boundaries she had set, and their conversations grew slowly more honest with each passing month, no longer built around status or appearances, but around the kind of questions he should have asked years earlier. He asked about her work, genuinely, and listened when she answered. He asked about her grandmother, about the properties, about what she hoped for the company in the years ahead, and Rochelle found herself answering these questions with a patience she had not expected to feel. Whether the marriage would ultimately survive remained an open question neither of them rushed to answer, because both had finally learned that some things, trust chief among them, could not be repaired on any schedule but their own. Months later, a new housekeeper named Angela Ruiz joined the staff at one of Rochelle's largest properties, and during her first week, she watched Rochelle move through the halls with the same quiet purpose she brought to every visit, checking corners, adjusting cushions, speaking warmly to every member of staff she passed. Angela had heard whispers among the other employees about who this woman truly was, but she had not yet fully believed them, and one afternoon, working up the courage, she finally asked the question directly. "Do you really own all these houses?" Angela asked, her voice carrying the particular disbelief of someone still adjusting to a truth too large to easily accept. Rochelle paused in the hallway, considering the question with the same care she gave to everything, before offering a small, genuine smile that carried no trace of pride or superiority. "No house is ever worth more than the character of the person who walks through its door," she said. The words carrying the weight of everything she had learned across 9 years of marriage and a lifetime spent understanding that value was rarely visible on the surface of things. She placed a gentle hand on Angela's shoulder before continuing down the hallway, her uniform still faded, her cleaning bag still slung over one shoulder, indistinguishable in appearance from any other member of the staff, moving quietly through the grand rooms of a house that, in every legal sense, belonged entirely to her. The camera of memory, if such moments could be captured and held, would have pulled slowly backward through that hallway, past the tall windows overlooking the manicured grounds, past the framed deeds still hanging in the office down the corridor, out through the front doors, and into the wide daylight beyond, where the estate stood exactly as it always had, quiet, dignified, and enduring. Rochelle Avery remained where she had always been, cloth in hand, ready to attend to whatever task the day required of her, unmoved by the scale of what she owned, because she had never measured her own worth by it in the first place. Her story did not end with revenge, and it did not end with triumph over her husband's downfall, because triumph had never been what she wanted from any of this. It ended, instead, exactly where dignity always lives, quietly, patiently, in the simple decision to remain fully herself, even when the world finally saw the truth of who that self had always been.